Hey, Oktoberfest.
I don't know if we can drink and do the pod at the same time.
Right here.
That's one of the more impressive backgrounds we've had.
That's very impressive, actually.
Yeah, like one person was.
There we go. That's it. One and done. We've seen them. All right. Well, that's a good way to get started. Here we go. Welcome to RenMac Off Script. We'll discuss markets, economics, policy, history, and life. It is the 27th of September, 2024. I'm Jeff DeGraff.
And I'm Steve Pavlik.
And you saw Neil Dutta there. Joining us from Munich and Oktoberfest. Probably best that his connection cut out. I know the one thing he thought that we should discuss, or at least his take, is the main thing right now is that the revisions imply stronger productivity growth, which by itself isn't a reason for the Fed to second guess anything it's already done. So it is too loud in the Hefeweizen tent. I don't know exactly what tent he's in, but that is his, or those are his thoughts. But Steve, let's turn to the election. I know Kamala is going down to the border. Good move, bad move? That seems maybe fraught with peril. Other than I'm sure it's so well scripted that there won't be any snafus. But what's the strategy there?
Well, let's try to eat into what remains one of her bigger liabilities in terms of the issues. That issue of border security and immigration is often mentioned right behind the economy in terms of voters' top issues. Obviously, one where Trump maintains a wide margin. And so the rationale, I think, to your point, is to give a scripted speech to try to address it and at least reduce Trump's lead in that area.
You know, if you're a pitcher and your fastball is your best pitch, you don't throw curveballs to the best batters. You throw fastballs. It is your strength against their strength. Even if they're a fastball hitter, you throw fastballs because, you know, you're really trying. So why she's throwing a curveball here, that's not her best pitch, that doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, one thing, and what we'll see whether or not it's a sign of hubris, is you have seen some movement in her direction in narrowing Trump's lead on the issue of the economy. You've seen that in the polls, albeit that's compared to where Trump was over Joe Biden before he got out of the race. But over time, we've seen more favorable polls for Harris generally, and Trump's lead on the issue of the economy has really narrowed. And I think that's why you saw both candidates this past week give dueling speeches here on the economy, both in battleground states that, in my opinion, neither one can afford to lose. Trump doing his Tuesday in Georgia, Harris doing hers Wednesday in Pennsylvania. I thought it was a little misleading for both, to be honest, because they're sort of billed as new economic proposals. We didn't really get anything new. I think at best we saw sort of how both of them sort of frame their economic visions, but really it was just more of the same. Trump's sort of, I think, message was trying to get companies located abroad to relocate jobs to the U.S. through several incentives. And if they're not motivated by that, the threat of the tariffs. And again, that's nothing really new. And then on Harris' side, we heard her talking about her goal of growing the middle class, trying to speak more as to this opportunity economy, but not really much in terms of any new proposals or even specifics.
Interesting. A lot of mist and things floating around the edges for sure there. You know, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but we've seen from our seat, our quantitative seat, a real momentum surge price momentum surge out of China, out of Hong Kong. We made a contrarian call back in the spring or late winter of this year. And that became more of a trend call. We were hoping it would develop into momentum, and that kind of fizzled in the summer, but the trends never reversed, which was good news. Now we're actually pressing into it because we are seeing that momentum. Is there anything on the policy front? I know that China cut their rates. They're encouraging banks to lend into the securities market, which by itself isn't great, but that does tend to gain some traction eventually, and I think that's important. It probably won't look like a property boom, but is there anything from the policy standpoint here in the U.S. that jumps out to you as being impactful and maybe catalyzing this?
I mean, I think in terms of maybe strength applied by result of weakness. I mean, my guesses are not trying to stimulate their economy. They thought things were going swimmingly, which, think down the road, what does that mean? Particularly if you see a return of Trump and this renewed trade war that he might want to revisit. Last time in 2018, I think just objectively, China was in a much stronger position. This time they may not. So if you're trying to game out sort of the potential scenarios and how China might respond to this. I think that's something to keep in mind. More if Trump wins. Harris, I think, is likely to keep on more of the targeted tariffs towards China. I don't really see any major change there. But, going back to earlier this week, both sort of acknowledge the threat China poses to U.S. economic and security interests. I thought it was interesting, both sort of stress this need to promote artificial intelligence in the U.S., really maintain a competitive advantage there, and the threat of maybe losing that edge to China. So that was sort of one of rare opportunities where both candidates were sort of on the same page. And I think that's probably something to watch moving forward. And, one of the things that's been getting more attention, at least in Washington, is this increase in utilities. I mean, sort of if you have try to realize this potential with AI, you're going to need a lot more power sources. And so whether that's going to be bullish for utilities or other sources of energy like nuclear, it seems like these tech companies are trying to pursue these energy sources to really move forward. I mean, that probably, sure you have an opinion on that, but that's something I'm hearing more chatter on in the Washington circles.
Yeah, definitely this move in utilities here in the States, I think initially was viewed as being a defensive move and, this bond proxy, if you will, right? Lower rates, and therefore the value of those fixed income streams goes up. And so obviously utilities do well. That I think is not the entire story, if, even a big part of the story. I think it is global in nature. Now we are seeing global rates contract, so that's obviously important. But the real kicker here is that you're seeing strength out of Chinese utilities. You're seeing strength out of European utilities that seems to be more in line with this, unquenchable thirst for electricity. Maybe not today, but going forward. And the policies that really led to this shortage, which is, not in my backyard and certainly not nuclear, right? So I think all of that ends up kind of coming home, and we're seeing the blowback of that. So a lot, even in tech, a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the strength and the breakouts now that we're seeing, right? So what's nice about consolidations is when you get breakouts, particularly if they're thematic, they tend to represent the leadership of the next cycle, right? So it might not be AI this time; it might be the power sources to AI that end up being the leadership, and that's really what we're seeing is, more of the strength in those AI surrogates, if you will, the picks and shovels, than AI by itself. So that'll be an interesting play as we go. I want to switch back because I think we've got a debate coming up this next week between vice presidential candidates. I do remember the one with Ross Perot and the admiral. I can't remember what his name was, but maybe just as good was the SNL spoof around that with Dana Carvey. I mean, that was just spot on. I don't think there has been a vice presidential debate that has had an impact on an election other than maybe that one and Ross Perot's chances back 30 years ago. What can each candidate hope to take out of this? What do you think the hot buttons will be? Is this just going to be, one pit bull facing off the other pit bull? Will it get nasty? I mean, is that going to be the entertainment value? What can we expect out of this debate?
Well, I think you're going to get more of a traditional debate back and forth compared to what we saw between Harris and Trump the first time. That said, as you alluded to, generally speaking, with sort of the June debate being, in my opinion, the more exception to the rule, with Biden being forced to drop out of the race after his performance, typically debates don't move the needle at the presidential level all that much. And so one can assume that the vice presidential debates move the needle even less. At this point, just looking at a Gallup poll, both candidates are still relatively unknown. So I'm curious to see how many people even tune in. But I wouldn't see any major movement here in the polls. So it's probably more of a do no harm. That's probably the goal of both candidates. Where I am interested to see, depending on if the outcome of the debate is sort of more lopsided? Does that sort of change the media narrative, which is sort of influencing people, again, whether consciously or subconsciously, and those persuadable voters and which side they may be leaning towards, as well as whether or not this might force a second debate between Trump and Harris. I mean, Harris is sort of suggesting she'll go ahead and do the CNN debate on October 23rd, I believe she said. You know, Trump has talked for a while now about doing a second debate on Fox News. You know, whether or not this debate can sort of maybe impact either campaign at the presidential level to follow through on that is sort of what I'm watching for. It wouldn't surprise me if we see another one. But, you know, I think one of the things to watch is these candidates in their campaigns are looking at their internal polling. And traditionally, if you're asking for the campaign debate, that's a sign that you're losing. Because why would you want to change the direction of the race? So that's something to just keep in mind moving forward.
Interesting. And as you see the swing states, and I don't know if you have the data right in front of you, but who's got the advantage, particularly as we look at Pennsylvania, as we look at Georgia, as we look at North Carolina? If the polls, you know, the polls that you trust, the ones that you think are, you know, have the least amount of bias or maybe are best reflected of the final outcome or results, where do you see those swing states?
Well, it depends on the swing state. And right now, what you're really seeing is sort of collectively, most of these polls in the swing states are within the margin of error. And in terms of being helpful and predictive, that's where, you know, sort of put that asterisk up there. Generally speaking, I think Trump is performing better in the Sun Belt states, seems to be doing better in Arizona in particular, as well as Georgia and North Carolina. I know there's been a lot of attention on North Carolina recently. We talked last week about the gubernatorial candidate down there, Mark Roberts, and his challenges. Keep in mind, though, Trump won in 16 and 20, whereas the Democrat candidate for governor won twice too, Roy Cooper. So they do have a history of ticket splitting down there between their presidential choice and gubernatorial level. I think Harris feels stronger in Michigan and probably in Wisconsin, though Wisconsin was the state that's been probably of them most notoriously off in terms of where their polling is versus where it actually the contest ends up. And my sense as a Pennsylvanian is Pennsylvania is pretty close. You know, some of the more recent polls have come out a little more favorable to Harris, so you might like that. But again, when you look at that in context to where Biden was leading in 2020 and where Hillary Clinton's lead was, again, versus where they ended up, that's something to consider. Have pollsters corrected? Have they overcorrected? Or do they still have a lot of challenges? You know, we won't know that until after the election. But I think the general takeaway is it's still a very close race. And as a result, you know, margins matter. And I think that's sort of what you saw going back to the economic speech, is both candidates at this point are very risk averse. The idea of putting any new policy out there that could be attacked from the other side and give your opponent an opening, at this point, the juice isn't worth the squeeze.
So you are a participant in a Deadpool. Do you pick P. Diddy as one of your candidates?
I'm still going to go with Biden.
Yeah, but you have to do it by age differential. So there's a lot of juice in P. Diddy. I mean, that's just kind of, are we going to see, is this the West Coast Epstein? Is this what we're dealing with? And this close to an election, how dangerous is that?
I have no idea. I was having some conversations with people whether or not did he overlap with Kamala Harris at Howard. I don't believe they did, so I just want to put that to rest. Do I think that's really going to hurt her electoral chances? Probably not. I don't think they're really going to be able to tie her to anything there. I'm actually more interested in seeing what happens with New York City Mayor Adams, because there are a lot of important congressional races in the House that could determine the control of the lower chamber in New York. And it sort of puts Hakeem Jeffries, the Democrat House leader, in a difficult position, sort of saying, you know, that Adams has a right uh, to defend himself, you know, presumed innocent until, or assumed innocent until proven guilty. But we'll see. You know, you're the governor there, Kathy Hochul. She has the ability to remove Adams from office,
Hmm.
and whether or not she decides to do that, depending on what more revelations come out, is something to keep an eye on. But again, I don't think that's going to really impact Harris too much, because it's not like New York is competitive, despite what Donald Trump thinks
Right.
or says. I should say says.
Right, right. I mean, it is pretty amazing, though, right around this election that is happening. You know, as you say, there are no coincidences in politics. Did he just piss off the wrong people?
That's his version of events. He's been sort of targeted for opposing some of the migration efforts, and that this is sort of his political opponent's revenge. Those Andrew Cuomo aficionados may look for his return to maybe jump into the race here to potentially replace him. I don't know. You're geographically closer in Connecticut than I am to New York politics, so you may have a better feel on it than I do. That's sort of my
Yeah.
sense from down here.
I mean, Hochul would just absolutely lose her mind if Cuomo became the mayor of New York City. That'd be unbelievable. I'm voting for him. I'll go back to New York just to vote for him, just to watch that train wreck. Well, let's talk a little bit about the markets because I do think there are some important things happening. We haven't yet got confirmation that cyclicals are coming back, but certainly they have. They have improved. I would not make that a definitive call here, but certainly worth keeping an eye on. I'd love to see a deeper oversold condition. I think from a cyclical standpoint, probably the best thing that we've seen is this modest, and I want to emphasize the word modest breakout in Bitcoin, got through 65,000. What that really does, that's not a quote unquote breakout by traditional measures. It is really just now setting the tone for this sequence of higher highs and higher lows. So we went down and retested. We stayed well above the lows that we saw back around the shakeout in the yen carry trade unwind. We stayed above that level here a couple weeks ago, and now making a higher high from the rebound off of that. So that's that new kind of mini sequence, if you will, of higher highs, higher lows. Getting through 72,000 would be an official breakout and reestablish the uptrend. But I do want to just talk a little bit about China because I think it's so very, very important. And you're seeing it in materials here, you're seeing it in copper, you're seeing it in some of these ancillary areas, even things like Las Vegas Sands, wind resorts, some of those that have ties to Macau. But if we look at the internals within China, I think one of the more interesting parts of this story is that the ETF outflows have been extreme. They've been, essentially washed out. Nobody cares. People are fearful. And it really reminds me of 2008, 2009. Policymakers are pushing on a string, et cetera. And that might all be true. But if you look at the distribution of outcomes, I think the chances are if you're wrong or we're wrong and it doesn't work, we're going to be wrong by a little bit. If it does work, we're going to be right by a lot. And that's really one of the beauties of this business is you have that asymmetric outcome of returns. And I think that's exactly what China is showing us right here. You've had what we call pure momentum, no doubt about it. We had something like 40% of the names overnight with positive volatility alerts, which means they're statistically meaningfully more volatile to the upside than what we'd otherwise expect on any given normal day. That's a big, big number. 20-day highs are the highest that we've seen in a decade in Hong Kong and in China. And that's coming off of those extremes from sentiment, which means that people aren't there. In other words, just to get back up to benchmark weight, just to get back up to something where the rally doesn't hurt you is going to require an awful lot of money flowing in just to, again, normalize and get to a benchmark weight. So I think there's a lot of really good things happening there. There is this wall of worry. There's the skepticism. We've labeled that the incredulous advance. That's usually the part of every single new burgeoning very bullish bull market. And we certainly see those attributes here in this tape. The other thing I would just point out from the market's perspective is obviously we've seen some steepening of the curve. That tends to be good news longer term. It doesn't tend to be good news in the short run, but good news longer term. And again, I think that has to be looked at in conjunction with what we're seeing from the spreads, and whether it's double B versus triple B spreads versus treasuries, really across the credit spectrum, we have yet to see a lot of angst, anxiety, or stress in the system that would suggest that the economy is, in fact, hitting that aerodynamic stall speed. That just doesn't seem to be the case. So, the idea that the soft landing, sticking that landing, as we like to say, certainly seems to still be in place. We'll be watching. Maybe you get a consolidation in China. I think it's a mistake to wait for that. I think you want to actually make sure that you have exposure there and not sit on your hands. But we're going to be watching that next week along with some of these internals. But Steve, what are you watching for in your work?
Well, watch a VP debate on Tuesday. The other thing I'd watch Tuesday, if we get to that point, is this potential East Coast port strike. I'd really be surprised if that happens, just given the Biden administration's desire to avoid a strike to hurt Harris's chances. But we'll see. I mean, from their standpoint, the organized labor groups maybe just be pushing harder now, trying to maybe overplay their hand. And if we see a worst case scenario, which people start experiencing shortages and stuff, that is something that can influence the election. So that's really what I'm keeping an eye on.
Right. Well, in terms of levels, we've obviously had a new high for the S&P. That's hard to, look at a new high in the S&P and then draw a bearish conclusion. Not usually in your best interest to do that. 5167 is support. 403 on the 10-year is the next resistance level. We've got support down at 325. So obviously a pretty wide spread there. But keep in mind the trends for the 10-year yield are still lower. True for the 2-year yield as well. And you're seeing that contraction in those real yields have a bullish impact on gold, on silver, and the like. So I continue to believe that there's something there as it relates as well to the China trade. Join us again next week. We'll be 1 week older, 1 week wiser. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, YouTube as well. And if you want deeper insight, you can go to renmacaccess.com where you can get some of our work. Until then, I'm Jeff DeGraff.
And I'm Steve Padlet.
We'll see you.